Good evening, everybody. My name is Alex Bovey, and I'm head of research here at the Courtauld, and it is a very huge pleasure to welcome Professor Elizabeth Sears to the Courtauld as our visiting expert for the summer term. Known to her friends and colleagues, and I think I'm both, as Betsy, she is George H. Forsyth Jr. Collegiate Professor of the History of Art at the University of Michigan, where she is currently, and for one more year, I think, departmental chair. Now, many of you will be are very familiar with our visiting expert series, which has been running for a long time, and which normally consists of somebody coming to the Courtauld and having a very intense week here with us. And in this case, our distinguished visitor, Betsy, is doing something a little bit different. She's here for more than a week, and we're sharing her expertise in, I think, a very interesting way with our sister institution, the Warburg Institute. And I'd like especially to welcome the very many of you Warburgians here this evening. And I'll explain a little bit more about this in a moment. Now, Betsy is, as you will doubtless be aware, a prolific scholar whose work has taken her more or less simultaneously along two different but related tracks. She's written extensively about medieval art, and her 1986 book, The Ages of Man, remains, for me, an indispensable and thought-provoking introduction to representations of the human life cycle. And there are many, many other publications beside, which are almost unsummarizable in their variety. She's worked on materials, especially including manuscript illumination and ivory carving, and craft traditions more generally feature very significantly. And she's also worked a great deal on medieval Paris and on other places, and on iconographic problems, notably including portraiture and the representation of the senses, spanning really from the Carolingian Empire to the close of the Middle Ages. So that's one career. Her other scholarly career is as a historiographer. And in this vein, she's produced a really remarkable body of historiographic publications, focusing especially, but not exclusively, on the Warburgian tradition. And in this context, she's written about Warburg, Panofsky, Vint, and Bing, amongst many others. Now, she's visiting us for her summer term visiting expert series, wearing her invisible but still very distinctive historiographer's cap. During her stay, she will be sharing her work on the entangled histories of the Courtauld and the Warburg Institute, the Courtauld opening in 1932, and the Warburg relocating from Hamburg and opening in London in 1934. Now, our relationship is best known, I think, to the wider world in the context of the celebrated Journal of the Warburg and Courtauld Institutes. But as I think we're all about to learn, our connections run much deeper. And the talks that Betsy is going to be giving here tonight at the Courtauld and next Tuesday, the 29th, at the Warburg Institute, are a foretaste of her, what I think will be a really magnificent magnum opus in perhaps as many as 3 volumes, I think, called Warburg Circles, 1929 to 1964. Tonight, Betsy will be exploring the foundational chapters of our shared Courtauld-Warburg story, and next week we'll move to the Warburg to take the story into the Gombrich-Blunt era. And if you'd like to come to that event, please go either onto Warburg's website or onto our own Research Forum website, where there will be a link to book tickets. Now, before I hand over to Betsy, I just want to observe that this is a very apposite moment, I think, for us to be thinking about our shared pasts. Right now, the Warburg and the Courtauld are working very hard on very ambitious capital projects that will build in both very literal ways, but also in metaphorical ways, on the traditions that have prospered in both places really since the early 1930s. And as we branch out and look to the future, I personally think it's incumbent on us to think about our roots. And that, I don't want to cast her as a kind of therapist for the two institutions, but I think this is the opportunity that is afforded by her visit. So I want to warm you very welcome. And pass over to you, Betsy. Thank you.
much. That was a lovely introduction. I also want to thank you for having put this together, but also for having put me in the position of writing 2 talks on this topic that I hadn't known about and thought about. I certainly started here doing my dissertation in the late 70s, and so the Warburg-Courtauld connection and tension has been with me all these many years. I look at John Loudon, we wrote our dissertations in the same bank of desks at the Warburg Institute at the very same time. So to pull out of the archives and put together a story was an kind of interesting challenge, and I was surprised with some of the results. You'll know more at the end and see if you have that reaction as well. Alex anticipated. Do we have lights down, or is this good?
I think because we're recording you.
Oh, you want lights up? Right, good. As Alex said, I think that which most connects the Warburg and Courtauld Institutes in people's mind today is the journal. Started in 1937 as the Journal of the Warburg Institute, became the Journal of the Warburg and Courtauld Institutes in 1940 under very particular historical circumstances, as we'll hear, and it continues under that title to the present. Volume 80 appeared last year. As we'll see, this journal is just a tiny part of the history of the interconnections. This image is an architect's dream vision of the physical suturing of the 2 institutes. The plan was drawn up by Adam Holden and Pearson in 1954 to realize an idea born in the 1930s, whereby the University of London would provide a purpose-built structure to house, or better to juxtapose, the 2 art historical institutes, the German and the British, the emigre and the homegrown. They would be under one roof in the central university precinct in Bloomsbury. The utopian plan never came to fruition, owing to waning will and resources. The Warburg Institute got its half, and the museum that was the Courtauld Institute Galleries was long lodged on the upper floor, certainly it was in my day when I started, of what was to have been a 2-winged structure. The other half of the row of terrace houses built by Thomas Cubitt in the early 19th century still stands. The partial destruction of the row had been very much lamented by urban historians already in the 1950s. So the Courtauld Institute remained in its elegant, if inadequate, quarters in Portman Square, an Adam House provided by Samuel Courtauld, built in the 1770s. Here the Courtauld would reside until the move to Somerset House in 1989, a move that allowed the retrieval and rehousing of the art collections. The dream vision, and here's the ground plan. I thank Bill Sherman for giving them to me. The dream vision and its non-realization can be taken as an emblem of a complicated history. It's a history worth attending to, for it is full of interesting tensions, cultural, social, methodological, both institutional and personal. These throw light on the roots, nature, and development of Anglophone art historical practice, I'd say. The imbricated history of the 2 institutes has an epic flavor. It's a story of survival, of near failures and recoveries, of acts of extraordinary generosity in the context of fairly vicious academic politics. All along, it's characterized by earnest efforts to educate students in the fledgling field of art history, a field that had a dubious status in Britain at best. So, as Alex said, today's lecture is the first of 2. This one provides a history of institutional codependence set against the tumult of the early Nazi era. The main point will be that in 1933, the year of Hitler's Machtergreifung, the same men who had founded the Courtauld Institute in the previous year backed the project to import the Warburg Library from Hamburg and act both compassionate and strategic. I'll take the history through the pre-war years, a precarious time for both institutes. In 1936, the Warburg was on the verge of folding, and the Courtauld was teetering. Its first director, W.G. Constable, had resigned in a dramatic gesture. Their fates at this juncture were particularly closely entwined. Next week, in the second lecture, take a different tack. It will be called Complementarities, and going over some of the same chronology, going a little bit further. I'm going to try to drill down into issues of method and pedagogical philosophies. Each institution can be said to have provided its partner with a surfaceful other. You might call it reactive self-definition. I hope the lectures will give food for thought to those of you here on the ground, stimulus perhaps to thinking about the future and possible collaborations. There's been a good deal of thought over the decades already. The lectures are document-based. As Alex will have suggested, I've been in the archives for a long time now. I think I visited some 30. But chief among these has been the Warburg Institute archive. Here is Claudia Vedapol, friend and colleague, who has helped me so greatly over the years. And I will just put in a plug for the Warburg Institute archive as one of the richest and most complete institutional archives in the humanities, providing data for all sorts of fine-grained work on networks. The Courtauld, a little less self-conscious about documenting its own past, I think it's fair to say, will soon be getting an addition to the archive, and I can announce today that through a very odd series of circumstances, I've had turned over to me a cache of documents relevant to early Courtauld history. The medieval historian, not art historian, but historian, Giles Constable, son of the first director, deposited the bulk of his father's papers in the archives of American art in Washington, D.C., part of the Smithsonian. But he kept back certain materials so as to write an article about why his dad, he called him Daddy, why his father resigned from the Courtauld. Recently realizing he'd never get around to it, he said, "Betsy, would you like them?" So I said, yes. So I had my car at Princeton, he's at the Institute for Advanced Study, and so I keep them home. I'm kind of scanning them now because I don't want to mail them over in a dangerous circumstance. And they will ultimately be turned over to you. I have a picture of, if you haven't worked there it is, Warburg Institute Archive, the famous Notizkästen of A.B. Warburg right there. Wonderful archive, I really recommend it. And this is from Peter Lasko, a medievalist who was director of the Courtauld. You can go ahead and read it. This is to Professor Constable. Lasko had gotten in touch with Mrs. Constable, Olivia, here in Boston, saying, "What happened to the Constable papers?" And she said, "Oh, my son has already deposited them in Washington." And so they went back and forth a little bit, and then came this. He heard about the box of, as he's saying, sensitive materials, the sensitive box, which is what's sitting in my office back in Ann Arbor. And it said that, as you read, that he didn't care, or they couldn't logically go either to Washington or here, and they're going to come here. Giles and I have a contract, so you'll get them. I will bring up some more amusing bits from the box in today's talk. So let's begin. Here's the dramatis personae, the chief players at the Courtauld. Lord Lee, Viscount Lee, Lord Leo Ferrum, who took charge. By all accounts, a very widely detested individual. With him, the lawyer Sir Robert Witt, creator of the famed collection of reference photographs. A man, W.G. Constable, in time began to find more and more dangerous. Samuel Courtauld, industrialist and collector, a key figure. And one can really say, had he not provided financial support, the Courtauld would not have been founded, the Warburg Institute could not have traveled to England, and the Warburg Institute would have foundered in the 30s. And then finally, on the bottom, W.G. Constable, competent and principled man, and the smoother of the way, very important in this history. Constable, this is from the papers in the Archives of American Art. Constable was a World War I veteran, an artist turned art historian, who left the position of assistant director of the National Gallery for the Courtauld directorship. He was well known in London circles, and clearly his eyebrows were adapted to caricature. He was prominent especially for having organized those big, famous blockbuster exhibitions that took place in the Burlington House in earlier days. So Dutch art, Italian art, French art, British art. He was involved with all of those. Also exhibitions of Elizabethan art and Spanish art at the Burlington Fine Arts Club. It's a very well-known figure. Now, it was in 1928 that the Provisional Committee had been convened to launch the Courtauld. I don't necessarily want you to read through all this, I just wanted it as proof. This is an article from the Times. It was a victory. He could announce it in May 1930. A new institute was to be created. The university, that's why I have a little red digger there, the university would supply appropriate housing in Bloomsbury. So this shows even before it's created, it was going to go to Bloomsbury. The country in this article was urged to rally round and give funds. It was, quote, a national reproach that there was no facility for training art critics and museum experts. Lord Lee assured his public, I love this line, it is not that our people are less intelligent or naturally less appreciative of art than their foreign contemporaries. No, it is simply that they are afforded no adequate facilities for study or for developing their critical faculties. Also to be factored in was the deep-seated distrust of anything highbrow. But the rising generation was showing itself hungry for the kinds of knowledge which would enable them better to understand and appreciate works of art. Lord Lee identified Britain's rivals as Austria, Germany, and America. The Kunsthistorische Institutes, as you see, misspelled, well done, were churning out experts. And in this, he was certainly correct. German, as they always say, was the Muttersprache, the mother tongue of academic art history. And departments in abundance were forming even before the First World War. And in Hamburg, a university founded only after the First World War, very late, in 1919, there was, by 1930, a thriving art history seminar directed by Erwin Panofsky. All the Hamburg art historians in training worked at the Warburg Library, Kulturwissenschaftliche Bibliothek Warburg, a private library founded by A.B. Warburg, supported by the wealth of his family, a prominent Jewish banking family. Here, reproduced 1 million times, is the famous portrait of the 5 brothers. Paul, Felix, Max, Fritz, and A.B. charmingly, wittily, on the side, is holding his hands out in this formal portrait in a begging gesture, because that is what he did constantly. He was the scholar, he didn't go, the rest were financiers. He was the scholar with the vision, the institutional vision that he infected his followers with. And he was always demanding money, pleading for it. The younger brothers, Max and Fritz, were based in Hamburg, Felix and Paul in New York. They were the American branch. And they were all involved with funding the library, and even after their brother's death in 1929, and despite the Depression, which cut the budget, they continued, if reluctantly, to fund the library. It wasn't all smooth sailing. In a brochure produced at the time, Lord Lee claimed that Harvard's Fogg Art Museum was the chief model for the Courtauld, and this is doubtless true. But the committee had looked around, and I just came upon this. It's just such a strange foreshadowing. In the Warburg Library annual report of 3132, that is before there was any idea of leaving, Saxl wrote of a visit from London, and I'm translating. Perhaps no visit this year was as important as that of Miss Rhoda Wellsford, the librarian of the first English Art Historical Institute now coming into being. She was sent to Hamburg by its director, Professor Constable, to study the facilities of the library so that the new institute, the Courtauld, could learn and borrow from it. Miss Welsford was with us for several days, and we hope that, and this is just to me so funny, despite all the differences in the bases, the Grundlagen of our institutes, many of our arrangements will be taken up in the organization of the great new sister institute. So it was a Shrestha Institute before anybody put them in the same town. Natural links and fundamental differences, this is going to be the running motif of these lectures. In 1931, Miss Rhoda Welsford would have first met the academic staff of the library, all of whom would immigrate to London with the library. Fritz Saxl, his partner Gertrude Bing, and the philosopher art historian Edgar Finch. We'll hear a lot about them, of course. The shock of the founder's death, 1929, was still upon them. Their collective ambition was then to realize the promise of A.B. Warburg's art historical study of culture, as he called it, Kunstgeschichtliche Kulturwissenschaft. He used the red image, das gelesene Bild, to monitor shifts in mentality, in orientation over time, the great case study being the influence of antiquity on post-antique European culture, the Nachleben der Antike. So, the Courtauld opened in October 1932 as part of the University of London. A multi-tracked curriculum had been devised, BA honors, MA, PhD, and a diploma course. Also, a vigorous program of public lectures had been instituted. There's just a photo from the first prospectus. The plan at this point was not to have a permanent staff, but for Constable and Mr. J.G. Mann, a specialist in armor, who was the deputy director. There I've got bolded their names. These are the people teaching at the beginning. But also the London museums were raided, so British Museum, V&A, and others supplied teachers. And they got some young, pretty much self-trained art historians, including prominent figures who are going to loom large in this talk: Kenneth Clark, Ellis Waterhouse, Anthony Blunt, of course. The pre-Hitler lineup of the Courtauld, if we look at this again, I've got those names bolded, was pretty well just British, exclusively British. In 1933, everything began to change. So you can do a kind of a what if Hitler hadn't come to power, this would have been the staffage, these would have been the people teaching for years and years and years. But emigre lecturers begin to turn up on the lists come 1933. Lots of them. This is a way they could get a little bit of money for doing a course or a lecture series, and they were jobless, unemployed. It was a hard life for them. The art historians from Germany were of various stripes. We have Wilhelm Pinder, the Nazi sympathizer, and Friedrich Antal, the Marxist. We have Peter Breeder, A.E. Brinkmann, Walter Friedlander, Nicholas Pevsner, and then the Hamburgians, Erwin Panofsky and Fritz Saxl. The situation, famously, had rapidly deteriorated in Germany during the Courtauld's first year of existence. Hitler was made chancellor in January 1933. The so-called Aryan paragraph, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, was enacted in April 1933, stipulating that civil servants of non-Aryan descent, Jews, were to be retired out. And this, of course, included university teachers and museum employees. In Hamburg, there was descent into chaos. And I always think it's a good exercise to think of oneself in this position. Right before the new semester is to begin, you have already posted classes in the brochure, you've put together your syllabi, you're ready to walk into the classroom, and you find most of your faculty has been dismissed, but you're not quite clear because there's strange rules, like if you fought in World War I, you might be able to stay on for a while, things like this. So quite some confusion. There's a letter that I found illuminating, sent from Charles de Tolnay, who is an Aryan, a Hungarian Catholic, who was on the faculty at that point. And Saxl said, I don't know what's happening, and he put it this way: Panofsky, Stern, and Richard Salomon will not be teaching. Ernst Cassirer has petitioned for leave. Wendt, Hans, Liebeschütz, and I myself, all three of Jewish extraction, he doubted would be teaching. And he said this might mean only two people, one from a museum, a local museum, and Werner Bohrmeister would be left. This Bohrmeister, I've read his accounts, oh my God. He was an early and fanatic Nazi. Even the Nazi rector said, is krank, he's sick. But I can't even tell you, he became paranoid. If you wanted to, me to tell you stories about it. But he became paranoid about the continuing influence of the Warburg crises, even after in exile, and he was saying, is the hub in London or in Princeton? Which brings us to Panofsky in due course. Of the Warburg Library at this point, just before term was to begin, because it wasn't state-controlled, it could carry on, and as Saxl said in April, nothing has changed for the present, but in time the Jewish associations of the Institute, the money and the staff, proved too much, and they closed the reading room in October. Now in Britain, countermeasures were taken with remarkable speed. So it was just 6 weeks after the promulgation of the Aryan paragraph, 6 weeks, when you think of the speed of governments today. The Academic Assistance Council, which was later renamed the Society for the Protection of Science and Learning, was formed under the lead of Sully Beveridge of LSE. A proclamation went out at that time. Many eminent scholars and men of science and university teachers of all grades and in all faculties are being obliged to relinquish their posts in the universities of Germany. The universities of our own and other countries will, we hope, take whatever action they can to offer employment to these men and women as teachers and investigators. So they began to find a way to bring and house and employ university professors. The interesting thing is that it's the established scholars who are targeted. And you find the sadness of people who hadn't quite got their job, who were finishing their doctorates. They could not say they had a position, and therefore their applications were not even considered, which was hard luck for many. On the other hand, it was a charitable thing. On the other hand, again, strategic, because one got the creme de la creme brought over. They worked with many charitable organizations, Red Cross and others in America, Emergency Committee, always exchanging information. What I found so interesting, these papers, by the way, are in Bodleian. What I found so interesting was on the first draft agenda of the first meeting of the Academic Assistance Council, the Warburg Institute appears as an agenda item. So it got on at the beginning, June 1st, 1933. They were recognizing that this was a serious problem and this institute was in jeopardy. Now, there are many tales of who saved the Warburg Institute. And there's truth in a lot of them. I have found that the SPSL files are the best source for sorting things out because everything's dated and you just see letter after letter. Also, Constable's diaries in Washington are very, very useful. So the library staff, with the backing of the Warburg family, had decided to emigrate. So they would regroup outside Germany as a center of culture and learning. And they were looking at a lot of possibilities. They went to Italy, which was the most logical. They'd been thinking of that even for some time. They tried Switzerland, they tried the Netherlands, where Huizinga helped them, but they never could find the money, and so they ended up at Britain, but that was just one of the possibilities initially. And it was Edgar Vint, with good English and many connections, who secured the first nibble in the UK. In May 1933, he arranged meetings with prominent members of the Anglo-Jewish community and was recommended to the attention of Sir William Beveridge by the Honorable Mrs. Franklin. She noted in her letter to that, well, it wasn't even founded yet, it was on its way to the AAC, to Beveridge, Vint was a Jew but not a refugee. And that, quote, he had various academic and educational plans for the benefit of the German Jewish population. On May 31st, the day before the first meeting of the Academic Assistance Council, Vint described the library and presented the case while someone took notes. So these are the typed up notes of an oral accounting of what the Institute was, how many volumes it has. You see, in a 4-storied house, that 4-story is going to be a motif right up to the present. And then what they are desirous of. They are desirous of arranging for the attachment of the library to a British university with the foundation of chairs. These 4, and later it became 6, would come over. And amusingly, the final observation, in confidence, the Warburg royal family is sympathetically interested in the proposal. So Vint was encouraged. He fired off a telegram to Bing in Hamburg. She cabled Saxl, who was in Amsterdam, looking at that possibility. That telegram reads, telegram from Edgar, London. Saxl urgently needed here. Please, telegraph your address. Greetings, Bing. So that was, Saxl, get over here, which he did. So, the English possibility. England had particular attraction for the Warburgians. Hamburg was and is an Anglophile city. And there was a general awareness that was comforting to them that Britain had a strong tradition in classical studies. But certain links had already been forged. These things surprised me, or maybe this one didn't. I knew that Vint had already conducted research toward a lecture, when translated becomes Hume and the Heroic Portrait, but he had gone deeply into 18th century portraiture and philosophy in their interactions. And this meant that he had been doing research over around 1930 in Britain, and that he had to meet, of course, a lot of upper crust owners of stately homes where many of the pictures were. So he had a lot of connections. But this lecture, it started as a lecture, was part of a series that the Warburg Institute had sponsored right there in 3031, England und die Antike, England and the Antique. And half of these lectures were given by Englishmen, and many of them subsequently became important allies and contacts. But it goes back before that. So, Panofsky and Saxl, the first thing in English is in the Burlington, and that is the famous investigation of Titian's Prudentia image. And it was, in fact, Campbell Dodgson at the British Museum who drew their attention to it, meaning that in Britain already there was a sense of, if you've got a really thorny iconographical problem, you want to go to Hamburg. And they did produce an absolutely ferocious display of learning in this article, showing what Germany could do. Saxl had previously had contact with Constable. There's just a funny letter in one of the archives. Constable was still at the National Gallery, and Saxl arranged that Constable remove glass from a picture he wanted to see. So that was a connection. Saxl and Meyer, who came as well, had spent many months in England as they were preparing the catalogue of astrological and mythological manuscripts in English collections. That meant Cambridge, London, Oxford. At which point, Saxl came to know Sir Robert Witt and his wife. Isn't that interesting? And with their full backing, in fact, I think their full pushing, he published an article in 1928 in French on a great institution of the history of art, the Witt Library. So already connections. And this is very famously known. It also proved significant that Kenneth Clark, in 1929, happened to be in Rome when A.B. Warburg gave his last public lecture at the Herziana, and Clark appeared. He would always say it changed his life, and he would be an ally of the Warburg Institute for 5 decades. The amount of correspondence from Kenneth Clark is extraordinary. It's just like email. You can just read it over a really long period. So with these connections, with this basis, things began to happen. In mid-June, 2 weeks later, 2 weeks after this first thing, a subcommittee was appointed by the Academic Assistants Council, and it consisted of Constable, obviously, C.S. Gibson, a doctor who was part of the AAC, and Charles Singer, interestingly, historian of medicine at UCL. Vince said, I need a statement for the Warburg family. Overnight, literally the next day. The subcommittee drafted one. I've typed it out just so it's a little easier to read. Point 1 is the university would heartily welcome the Warburg Library. It would meet a definite need in the intellectual life of this country, which I think within the history of art histories is absolutely true. But point 2, no money, sorry. And they hoped that the Warburg family would pony up. In July, Constable and Gibson traveled to Hamburg. And this is where Constable's diary comes in. The Warburg family put them up in the very swank, one of the best hotels in the world, Zeiten. The two Brits toured the library with Saxl and Vint. They dined at Max Warburg's home and met his son Eric, who would be important in the story. They put together the barest of bare bones budget, the absolute minimum, and they decided that perhaps a temporary arrangement, a 3-year loan, would go down best with German authorities. The family agreed to take care of transport, clerical salaries, book and equipment purchase. England would be responsible for academic salaries, installation, and maintenance. So that was kind of bad news. Poor Constable had to return to London and undertake a huge fundraising campaign, and it's difficult, we're in the Depression here, right? He also had to find a space big enough to hold a library, and they're not just thick on the ground in London. It's very hard. They tried to get a place in the Grosvenor or the Portman estates. That didn't work. But finally, Lord Melchett, this is of the Mond family, and that's an interesting story too. They helped with the Herziana and so on. But this was the younger one. Lord Melchett very reluctantly came through and offered 3 years and no more in a ground floor kind of corridor space in this, which was then a brand new office block, very state-of-the-art with elevators and things that they were bragging about. It had been constructed at Millbank because the Thames had just flooded over, so they had new land once it rained. And just down from the Houses of Parliament. And I'm sure many of you know this today, it's the home of MI5, which is just very famous. So Constable found this, consolidated the housing plan. It was happening so quickly. A week after that, Samuel Courtauld came through with an anonymous, no one knew the name at this point, anonymous grant of £3,000 a year for 3 years and no more, which made the move possible if it didn't cover the entire budget. Other sources had to be found for the academic salaries, Rockefeller Foundation, so on. And then this was the famous invitation, October 28, Lord Lee sent out a strategically worded invitation to Max Warburg, chairman of the Hamburg Committee, for the 3-year loan. It's in much the notice of myself and certain friends who are really interested in It has practically ceased to function as a living institution. It might be possible for it to temporarily house in London for a period of, say, 3 years, so that the advantages and facilities will be offered to In the event of it being possible for you to lend the library for such a period, I will inform you that we have accommodation of a temporary character in West End of London, and so on. In England, the Home Office and MI5 had to approve the transfer, and they did so with its skeleton staff of 5 Germans and 1 Austrian. They concluded, quote, The Institute appears to be entirely non-political and would probably be a valuable addition to London University. The German authorities too had to sign off, and the timing was favorable since it was early in the Nazi regime and things had not yet been centralized in Berlin. The Hamburg authorities, and it wouldn't have been the same in Berlin, let it go. If it be done quietly, no newspaper coverage at all. So, the Warburg Library, the Warburg staff stripped the Hamburg Library. They took everything, shelves, and the only thing they left was the electrical equipment, and they found out that it wouldn't work in England. Seriously, it was a disappointment. So 532 crates were shipped on December 14th. A few days later, deposited in Thames House. Mr. Benjamin Guinness supplied some money for the installation. They tapped him for money. It's a pun. Okay. The Warburgians realized they were on a very short leash. They had, what, 3 years. They were surprised to find out where they were, quite remote from London's academic centers. They said, well, we've discovered that with a 25-minute bus ride, you can get to the British Museum and so forth. They were grateful, but discomfited. So they had to do everything they could to woo visitors. And here, this is from the, oh, this is my Cornish Lighton, sorry. This shows how they unpacked. And they had to install it in a long, they didn't have 4 floors, they had sections. And so they put it all in a great row, and so it could go word, image, orientation, action. And actually, it worked surprisingly well, said they. And in Hamburg, not everyone knows this, visitors could not get to the stacks, but here their plan that they could was realized. So this was as it was installed. They tried so hard to get people down to Thames House and explore the library. So, and at home is an odd way of putting it, but they had an open house. The library will be open for the inspection of guests. They did all sorts of things, just such a flurry of activity. They were trying so hard, they didn't understand the system, whatever, but they did what they could. So they tried to integrate themselves into the interlibrary loan system. It's often noted that about half of their 70,000 books were not in the library of the British Museum. They deposited their backup card catalog in London's National Central Library, so it could be known what books they had available. 7 years later, that catalog was destroyed in the Blitz. So they had their own, but then they got really worried, and then they moved it out to the country. They wrote articles on their cataloging system for the Library Association record. All sorts of things. They offered their space for the meeting of a medieval group that Beryl Smalley ran. So they were trying so hard to present new questions, new methods to their new academic audience. They resumed their publishing. They started up a lecture series. They sponsored courses. And some were British, and others were their German, that was a French friend, German-Austrian. They provided research services. The letters are a hoot, I find. So, they wanted to show that they were giving, they were generous, they would pass on their erudition. So, you've got a letter, one example of somebody. The folklorist, Violet Alford, wrote from Bath, asking whether the Warburg Institute published folklore studies. They invited her to come up and have a tour of the library. Edgar Vint, who's a prominent figure, read through her whole manuscript on folk festivals of the Pyrenees. He discussed it with her, and he recommended it to Chatto and Windus, where they in fact published it in 1937. It's this sort of thing they did, which is amazing. Saxl was famous at generating projects. Connections with the Courtauld were strengthened in various ways. The head of the Courtauld photographic department came for several weeks to Warburg to learn its system, and worked with Rudolf Wittkover, who is German but had a British passport because where his father was born, where he was born when his father, I don't even know. But anyway, he had a British passport. And so they could bring him onto the staff, and they did so immediately, and he became head of the photographic collection. Saxl and Wittkover then, as art historians, both lectured at the Courtauld, but joint publications were also soon in the offing. They published early on an edition of English royal inventories, but then the big one was this. There was a project that stretched out for decades, a catalogue raisonné of the drawings of Nicolas Poussin. Started really as a favor to a displaced scholar, Walter Friedlander, who had lost his professorship at age 60, poor man, at Freiburg im Breisgau in 33. So Wittkover was made the point person, but Blunt was brought in to represent the Courtauld. He was already linked, as we've seen, and this project really became a training ground for him. He had in fact Blunt had first met Friedlander in Germany, and now he was brought in first to kind of translate Friedlander's unruly German prose into English, but then he became involved in fact-checking, editing, proofing, and then pretty much took over the project, which lasted all the way through his career. And this was the way in which the Warburg was helping self-trained Englishmen of that generation, and we'll see many examples next time, or a few examples next time. They loved to take a person in and just train individually, whether in connoisseurship or in content exegesis. But the connection here also, of course, made the Courtauld more able to transform itself into a research institute, which is what Constable certainly wanted. It was an anxious period at the Warburg Institute. Time was running out. The hour of eviction from Thames House and the cessation of funding fast approached. By May 1936, there was real fear that the Institute would be forced to store its collections. In one document, we read the desperate statement, quote, "If this takes place, it will mean that the one scientific institution which was saved from destruction under the Hitler regime will suddenly cease to exist even after its transplantation. One more hope will have been taken from those who believe in and fight for humanization and enlightenment." So the stakes were deemed very, very big, and we have to acknowledge that as we look at this history, the fear, the desperation. All anybody could think to do, so it seems to me, was write petitions. So in June 1936, and this I find very moving, the young German emigres Hugo Buchthal and Ernst Hitzinger, who had come to London, prepared a letter of appeal which they sent to all the refugees they knew. A paragraph in German and then one in English for them to sign and return. And here it is, but let's look at the part in red. And you just see what the Warburg Institute meant for the Germans. Coming from Germany in search of a new life, they found in the Warburg Institute threefold help. A library which by its international character was suited to act as a bridge between the interrupted studies for which they were trained and the future work for which they were preparing. Isn't that so interesting? A staff willing to give advice with regard to openings in England, recommendations, and opportunities for personal contact with members of English learned institutions. And yes, incredible numbers of examples of that. And a body of students, German as well as English, eager to include them in their circle, prepared to discuss their problems and to further their studies. We'll hear a great example of that in the next lecture. Separately, and it's so interesting that they kept these things separate, they had a petition that Englishmen signed. We understand wish to make an earnest appeal for help towards the retention and maintenance of the Warburg Institute and Library. And here, as you see, people who are representative of institutions, and then 51 further names. Petitions were never used because there was a plan B. Plan B was found. The Warburg Institute was saved because the Courtauld too fell into crisis just then. Ensuring the future of the Courtauld involved rescuing the Warburg. I think one can really say that. So let's work back. Now we get to the sensitive box. In December 1935, W.G. Constable, having at that point having been through a 3-year cycle with the candidates for the BA Honors Program, which was a 3-year affair, he found that there was a structural problem, as he felt, in need of solution. The undergraduate program was failing. The level was too low. The students too unprepared. Eminent faculty were spending their time teaching students, quote, how to read, make notes, use libraries. For the sake of fees, just about anyone was admitted. And the lack of studentships meant that good students wouldn't come. And these students were mostly men. We'll hear about a gender divide. So Constable had pitted himself against the founders, who were, he believed, too much invested in the popular side. And that was the word used again and again. He agreed this was important, and he was going to have plans in order to support it, but he argued there had to be, quote, a core of research and specialized learning in the Institute. So the lines of a fairly bitter dispute were made. Lee, Witt, and Samuel Courtauld versus the Constable and the Courtauld subcommittee, one should say. That is, lay members, as they called it, versus academics, popular versus scholarly. By May 1936, this subcommittee on academic policy, chaired by Constable, had met, and unanimously they developed radical suggestions. I'll put up Constable's chart, numbers, the people in the various degree programs, which he presented as part of his plan. The subcommittee proposed that the honors BA be suspended on the grounds that history of art was not a suitable subject for a first degree. It was too early for this specialization. The necessary underpinning of general knowledge and skills was best acquired in another subject. The Courtauld was becoming a finishing school. Too many women were being admitted without any university training, and the best men were not able to come, again, because of the studentships. Thus, the subcommittee suggested that only the MA, PhD, and diploma courses would be left. With respect to the higher degrees, Constable felt obliged to counter fears. And apparently, it was felt that such research might lead to, quote, a certain aridity in the Institute. No, he said, these would not be research courses, but they would be postgraduate courses, intent on giving meaning and direction to specialized work following a first degree. So you see all sorts of tensions and worries about research as something separate from teaching broadly. The committee had pondered an end to the diploma course, but thought it better to try instead to pull inappropriate students from it. And that would be to increase the standards for entry, and at the same time, start giving 100, 120 lectures a year that the public could go to for a small fee, and you then charge them something for going to the library. The feeling was many people were doing the diploma course only to get the library just access. This led to conflagration. By early July, Constable had tendered his resignation. There's a letter in which Lord Lee communicates fury to Constable because he felt there had been leaks and gossip and the press was sniffing around. So it was a public embarrassment of the worst kind for him. Lee then turned to the Warburg Institute to craft a new deal. The Germans, therefore, worried about whether they were going to exist, found themselves embroiled in high academic politics. In July, Bing wrote to Max Warburg's son Eric, laying out the awkward situation, their hesitations, and the new proposal. And we'll just be looking at the solution here. This is the building they were able to move into. Lee had suggested that the Warburg become a university institute undertaking postgraduate instruction. The University of London would supply housing in South Kensington, which they did anyway. And Samuel Courtauld would provide funding for another 7 years. So in order to save the Warburg, Courtauld came up with 7 more years, 10 in all, of funding. The two institutes would be fused administratively, but they'd be housed separately and have their own budget. Bing saw many drawbacks. The 7-year solution was just another short-term solution. Lee, famously prey to tyrannical tendencies, clearly had his own agenda. Moreover, it would be potentially embarrassing for the Institute to align with Lee and Witt against serious scholars. So they're realizing, we're in a situation here. Saxl and the rest consulted with friends, including Constable, and they consolidated their demands. If the Warburg took over academic duties, seminars, mentoring exams, and so forth, they would retain the right to control the directions of their research. Great word, Forschungstendenz. And I think that was what was always critical for them. And they would have oversight over their publications and their lectures. They said that they were trying for moral counterweight because, as they recognized, they had no financial counterweight at all. Their position was shaky. At this juncture, Saxl prepared what I find an extremely interesting document, and I'm going to shove off talking about it till next time. It was a 12-page text, as I say, setting out his vision for the complementary roles of the Warburg and the Courtauld. He concluded, having gone through his arguments, complete amalgamation cannot therefore be contemplated, whereas collaboration seems to be the obvious course of action. And he gave ideas on how collaboration could be achieved. In autumn 1936, agreement with the Warburg family was reached. The library would transfer from Thames House to a wing in this building, the Imperial Institute buildings, a Victorian-era white elephant, which the university managed. And here, in strange, cubicle, cramped quarters, the library would reside, apart from the war years, for 2 decades. They were provided annually with a sum of £5,500 from Samuel Courtauld. The Institute was to remain in England on loan for 7 years, beginning 1st of January 1937, and after that, the loan would presumably become permanent. The Warburg family wanted some international connections, sharing of books with Germany, and maybe some scholarships to German students. The likelihood of that happening was small, particularly as the catastrophes in Germany began to unfold. But a deal was made, and as being said in one letter, they could sleep easy for the first time in many years. Little known fact, in the summer of 1937, Lee offered Saxl the directorship of the Courtauld. It was an extremely good offer. They kind of wept when he decided to say no. He would have received double the income, a pension, and British citizenship. Quite the deal. It shows the degree of loyalty to the Warburg Institute that he refused to take this, in that he couldn't do both, they said. So he stayed with the Warburg, even though back at the Courtauld, everybody was resigning. So look at this. During the session, Constable retired, Mann resigned, Webb resigned, Ritchie resigned, Watson resigned, and the photographer, the library assistant, and the secretary. There was wholesale, I'm out of here. The Constable, to general surprise, was not given the directorship of the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, an in-house candidate was given it. And that meant that he left for the United States with his family to take up a post as curator at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and was really very happy there, so it wasn't a bad life. Among his papers, these are kind of funny, this is the farewell party at the Athenaeum, a company of friends. They have him as the guest of honor, and they all sign. And one interesting thing is there was not a single German on this list, so the refugee friends were not at the Athenaeum for the farewell to Constable. And they have the menu, which is so pretentious, consommé to start, and café, I was going to say coffee, café at the end. Some people saying cauliflower au gratin. But then, and this is where it gets really funny. Okay, so there's this whole stack of papers. There's no context, whatever, you can kind of figure it out. On the back of one of them, in pencil, it says Games with WG. So apparently what happens is there is a party of friends who are all extremely peeved with the Courtauld crew, the founders. And so I think it's one of these things where you write something and you pass it on, someone else writes something, someone else passes it on. So it goes on page after page after page, and then there are all these scurrilous caricatures, which are very funny. So this is the beginning one, Above the Dark Circus. Then somebody else writes, The Director's Digression by Viscount Lee of Fareham, published by the American Women's Club. So you can see that probably was just highly humorous. But then, I'll just show you a couple, I'm going to love to show you the whole thing. This is Sir Robert Witt talks seriously to Sir Alex Martin, down the line, a fate worse than death. And then, I think you're going to love this one, particularly in view of the room we're sitting in right now. Kenneth Clark and his manicurist. It's really pretty good. It's kind of young, so they were fine. Not everybody that I recognized, but a lot. So this was Constable's send-off. So just finishing up now. TSR Tom Bowes, the historian, medieval historian, was made director of the Courtauld Institute of Saxl. And he became a thoughtful, nice supporter of the Warburg Institute. He, like many, were very concerned because they felt the Institute was just not integrating well enough. They tried so hard, but they just didn't really have the ins. They just didn't understand the system. One person we'll talk about later talked about the refugee desire to lie low. They just felt they weren't really out there. So it was, in fact, he who suggested that the periodical be jointly published, and it was really as part of a way of helping the Warburg Institute to integrate into the British educational system. And so then he put himself and Blunt on the editorial board, really as a magnanimous gesture. Another thing he did was to bring Saxl in to advise the young Charles Mitchell, who was then, oddly, interestingly, because Oxford didn't have much art history, preparing a B.Lit thesis at Oxford on Grunewald. And this led to Saxl mentoring him and then to participating in his first British Viva, which was apparently quite a learning experience. Kind of funny letters about that. And in time, Mitchell would then be brought onto the staff to represent the English side before he landed ultimately in Bryn Mawr. Across the pond. The war years, and again, I'm just finishing up now, the war years saw renewed collaboration between the Warburg and the Courtauld. When the British went off to war, the emigres who couldn't picked up the slack at the Courtauld and taught the students who remained. Anthony Blunt, there he is a little older, was very much en route to the Courtauld directorship via a deputy directorship. I'll talk about that next time. He was in Bologna, stationed as a member of the British Expeditionary Force. And he wrote to Saxl, the Warburg Institute seems really to have worked miracles for the Courtauld. How grateful we are can never be said, but I hope you've gathered something of what the students feel about the lectures they've had. And it was during the year of the war, in fact, in 1944, that the 7 years came up, the end of the kick the can 7-year plan. And that meant that there was no suggestion possible of going elsewhere, going to America, going back to Germany, everything. It was a done deal by the end of the war. This is where the staff of the Warburg Institute was living communally during the war in Denham, which is at the very end of the Piccadilly line. This is when the bombs started falling, they decamped. Ideas for integrating the Warburg into the University of London, or finding some way to keep the institution permanent, had been floating for some time. In fact, it was Courtauld's son-in-law, Aryan Butler, as president of the Board of Education, who pushed plans in different directions. There was a first idea that the Warburg Institute might amalgamate with the Victoria and Albert Museum. Isn't that an odd one? And memoranda were prepared and what this would mean. That wasn't a go. But then there were protracted negotiations. I think we've heard so much about them. The trust deed was finally written in 1944, and the Warburg Institute became part of the University of London. After the war, the Warburgians returned to Imperial Institute buildings, pending the removal to the new buildings in Bloomsbury. Always this was held out. And now they were part of a government-subsidized institution. The change in status was a relief, but also a sadness, for it meant surrendering precisely the autonomy that had ensured survival. There were changes ahead, they knew, not least figuring out what course to pursue once the Nazi threat was behind them. And also just with the passing of generations, passing of time, Warburg's memory and mission were just fading. So what to do next? New intellects had been brought on board, among them Ernst Gombrich, saved from Nazi Austria, who had been invited to London from Vienna in 1936 to help Bain publish Edie Warburg's papers, but who had never known Warburg. He, in many ways, did represent the future of the Institute. In 1944, as the new day was about to dawn, a kind of tired, kind of depleted Saxl wrote to Richard Krautheimer, who had landed in America, of course, very famous architectural historian, good friend. He knew he had to find the energy for further initiatives. He knew new adaptations would be necessary, and so, you probably already read it now, I'll read that one. In a way, we are greatly looking forward again to taking up teaching, now that they're a part of the University of London. I do not know whether there'll be many students for anything so impractical as we can teach them. We shall not teach art history, that's what the Courtauld, but rather try to get the history or language student and give him what is, with an abominable word called background. So I think that this statement is a good place to end, because I'm going to be talking next time about complementarities, about mutual perceptions, about ideas relating to distinctions and points of possible interaction.